In this video, we're going to consider what exactly is it that philosophers do. And that's going to help us further think about what exactly philosophy is. So the first thing that I want to mention is it's helpful to understand what philosophers do by trying to understand what philosophers don't do. And so it's oftentimes thought that philosophers just talk about stuff and just ask questions. While that's true, in fact, one time my daughter, when she was about 4 years old, she said, "Dad, I know what philosophy is. Philosophy is just when you and your friends get together and talk about things." That's absolutely true, but it's more than just that. So we need to think about what philosophy is not. Philosophy is not merely having an opinion. It's not simply bullshitting with your friends. It's not merely, like saying, well, I think this is a cool idea. You have to defend your beliefs. You have to give reasons and arguments for your beliefs. And so that's what it is that a philosopher does. A philosopher doesn't simply take a position. A philosopher defends their position. Right? So our question is, what do philosophers do? One way to answer this question is to say we use reason and argument to examine or defend various beliefs or views. Right? So that's our main instrument of inquiry is reason and argument. So we'll need to say a little bit more about what that is as well. Right? So it is true that philosophers ask questions. In fact, you might even think that everyone's a philosopher in some sense because, just think about children and how a child will ask their question, why? They'll just continuously say, but why? Why is it like that? Why must I go to bed at 8 o'clock? Why do I have to eat my best vegetables? Why do I have to do such and such, right? So everybody has this sense of curiosity, wanting to know more and more, always asking these questions, right? So we ask the big questions, but we also ask the small questions. Right? So we ask questions about things like whether God exists. We ask questions about, how life has evolved. We ask all of these big questions, but we also ask the small questions about the things that we take for granted, the things that we assume without ever thinking about it, like whether tables and chairs exist. We ask questions about basic assumptions regarding how we know anything at all, right? So we ask the big and the small questions. But we don't do it simply because we think it's cool, right? That might be a phase that we go through, and that might even be a reason why you're taking this class, and that's great. I definitely started there myself. And sometimes you might even think a philosopher is somebody that never really grew out of that stage of asking questions at a very young age. But there needs to be something extra added to it. We need to add arguments. We give reasons in support of what we believe. We use premises that support conclusions. And there's different methods and different ways of doing this. And I've provided several different videos for you to look. They're optional videos on the website under the additional resources file. So please look at that. But what I want to say now is, in addition to arguments, we also use intuitions. We use our intuitions as evidence. Right? What is an intuition? An intuition is like an intellectual gut feeling. It's like our initial reaction to some claim or some situation or some hypothetical thought experiment where you think, oh, that's just definitely wrong, or that just intuitively seems obvious. It's just self-evident, or at least it seems it seems crystal clear. It's sort of this intellectual gut feeling that we have. Of course, different people's intuitions will vary from one person to another and across different cultures and different situations. But nonetheless, that's one of the main pieces of evidence that we use. It's not the only evidence that we use, right? We're perfectly able to use empirical data. We definitely should use empirical data. And when our intuitions are inconsistent with the empirical data, then maybe that suggests that our intuitions are problematic or wrong. So we use both our intuitions and the empirical evidence that's collected in the sciences or in, in surveys and so forth. And we also use thought experiments. A thought experiment is some hypothetical situation where we're exploring the different details of a case or some story or some sort of illustration that's going to help us think about our intuitions. They're supposed to elicit certain intuitions that we might have. And unlike in the sciences where we actually go into a laboratory and we perform different experiments, or when we go out into the field in order to collect data, right? We don't do that in philosophy. Instead, we use intellectual experiments, thought experiments. And that's one of the ways that we gain our intuitive evidence. And so that's one of the main pieces of methodology that we use in philosophy. And we use that in order to argue for or against some position. Again, it's not as if we cannot use empirical evidence or empirical data, or use what's available to us in the sciences, but we're not limiting ourselves to that. We also employ thought experiments and intuition as evidence. So those are some of the main things that we do in philosophy that separates us from what's going on in the science. And then finally, we also use concepts. We use a kind of conceptual analysis, where we've got some concept. Let's say we've got the concept of knowledge. And what we are going to do is we're going to try to consider what are the necessary and the sufficient conditions or features or elements that are needed in order for that concept to be adequately or correctly applied. There's all kinds of different concepts like memory or free will, or God, or whatever our concept might be. We have these intuitive sort of ways of understanding the concepts, and so we try to figure out what the necessary and sufficient conditions are for those concepts. Once we get a pretty good conceptual analysis of whatever the concept is, of knowledge, memory, free will, whatever it is, then we go out and we consider the empirical evidence. We sort of look to see what the world is like, to see if the world actually maps on to what our conceptual analysis has to say. And if it doesn't, if there's an inconsistency there, then we have to go back and make adjustments to our conceptual analysis. All the while we're using reason and argument in order to defend the different positions that we're taking with regard to our thought experiments, our intuitions, our concepts, and so forth. And this is how we go about both asking the big and the small questions, as well as providing answers to the big and the small questions, right? So it's not merely talking about all these cool and very interesting things. That's a part of it, but we have to do this other part as well.